Hey, everybody, welcome back to Crazy Money. I am your host, Paulollinger. Today, we're going to talk about belongingness. Yeah, you don't think about it all the time, but belongingness, our need to belong, is the third most fundamental human need as ranked by, not by BuzzFeed, no, by Maslow on his hierarchy of human needs. Just above safety and physiological needs is our need to belong. Once you got some food, some water, and some shelter, you need a tribe to hang with. And it's really important to understanding the way the world works, the way our minds work. My guest this week is Geoffrey L. Cohen. Geoff is the author of a book called Belonging, The Science of Creating Connection and Bridging Divides. He's also a professor of psychology and organizational studies at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. So you know he's a very smart guy. In this conversation, we talk about what it means to belong to a place, an organization, a family, or a movement, how belongingness and identity are intermixed, and what implications that has for how we discuss politics and other beliefs with people of differing points of view. We talk about why our need to belong might push people to more extreme political views and the way belongingness affects our performance at school and work. We also talk about what groups you'd rather not belong to, because while belongingness is important, you don't want to join just any old group, now do you? I know you're going to enjoy this conversation, folks. This is Geoff Cohen. Geoff Cohen, welcome to Crazy Money.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's great to be here.
Geoff, Maslow ranked belongingness as the third most basic human need. What does he mean by belongingness?
Well, belonging is the sense that we're part of a group to which we matter and can contribute, and to which we accepted accepted and included. So it's kind of a two-way street, belonging. It's a sense that we're accepted, but also the sense that we also matter to the group. And the group can be anything, right? It could be our family, it could be our friends, it could be our community. We, as human beings, are a social species, so we need some port on the shore, some place where we feel that sense of belonging. And if we don't really thrive. And a lot of research converges on that lesson.
How big a deal is it to not belong?
It is a very big deal not to belong. At the same time, a sense of belonging is situational. We might feel it in one context, like at work, we might feel like we're accepted, but in another context, for instance, out and about in our community, we may not feel a sense of belonging. The upshot, I think, is that we need some port on the shore, some place where we do feel that sense of belonging. And if we don't, we're sort of unmoored and adrift, and our health, our well-being suffers. So I think that not having a sense of belonging for us as a social species is a really detrimental thing, and it's one of the things that it's what being human is all about. Is about connecting with other people, and even kind of momentarily. We've all experienced this. You walk into some new environment, some new situation, some new workplace, it's a transition, and for a moment or maybe longer, we have that sense like, I don't know if I belong here. I don't know if people accept me. Maybe we're wondering if there's some stereotype out there about, academics, whether they should be in this situation or not. And it crosses our minds as to whether or not we are fully accepted in this situation. And that's something that my colleague Greg Walton and I called belonging uncertainty. And it's something that, we're just really attuned to. I have noticed just even... I have a pretty solid sense of belonging in academia, but I've noticed that, in certain situations, for instance, playing sports, all of a sudden it's that belonging uncertainty kicks in, and you really do feel it. I think as human beings, we're just exquisitely attuned to that sinking feeling that, oh, maybe I'm not wanted here. Maybe people are talking about me. Maybe I'm seen as a joke. And it can really be distracting and preoccupying, for all of us. I think we've all been there. We all kind of know what that's like.
Can you tell me about a time in your life where you felt particularly uncomfortable in a situation, not just like at a party, but like in a situation where you were like, oh, I'm not sure I made the right decision, or these aren't my people, or whatever?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel that quite a lot. I mean, as a kid, I think I don't know. The psychology being an outsider is quite familiar to me. I think as a teenager and as a kid, I often did feel like I was somewhat of a loner and an outcast. So I did feel it then. But let me focus on one that was really influential to me. When I left graduate school and took up my first job as an assistant professor, I felt acute uncertainty about my sense of belonging. And it wasn't that I didn't think I could do it, though that whether I could certainly became an uncertainty, but it was whether or not this was a place where people accepted me and was a place where people regarded and respected me. And I was starting off as assistant professor, and I was surrounded by all these grand poobahs of social psychology and psychology who were highly esteemed in their field. And I wasn't really in that environment. I felt very, very uncertain about whether this was a place for me, whether I could make it, and whether or not I was regarded as one of them. And I think that's a very kind of natural experience to have. I would notice this kind of influenced some of the research that Greg Walton and I later did. I would notice I would come home from work after that first year teaching, and I would come home and just feel drained. There were two effects. I felt psychologically drained. And when I look back on the day, asking myself, what had I done? I feel like, wow, not a whole lot. Yet nevertheless, I felt sapped. So that was like one aspect of belonging, feeling uncertain about our belonging, is it takes up mental and emotional space that could otherwise go to like more productive and constructive causes. The second thing I've noticed was that little things started to loom large. And I think this is kind of one symptom of belonging uncertainty. I remember my chair patted me on the back one afternoon and asked me, "How is your class going?" And immediately crossed my mind, maybe he heard something about my class, how terrible it was. And that is kind of what belonging uncertainty does. It kind of creates this tunnel vision, a vigilance, because we're kind of on the defensive. And that can be pretty costly.
So to what degree, now I was thinking about this, that you as a pre-tenure professor, tenure is this thing, you are either tenured or you are not. And that's a pretty big third-party verification of your belongingness, right? Was there pressure there, or was that just natural, not FOMO, but imposter syndrome that you were feeling at the time?
At the time, I think imposter syndrome goes hand in hand with belonging uncertainty, because there's a fine distinction, but I think important. And imposter syndrome may be more about your perceptions of your ability, right? Like, can I actually do it? And belonging uncertainty isn't necessarily about that. I think a lot of people have belonging uncertainty without really feeling a low self-confidence. They believe they can do it, but nevertheless, they're in an environment. Maybe they think that their manager doesn't like them, or maybe they think that their advisor has a low opinion of them. Maybe someone said something that really felt like an affront or an insult. Maybe I'm coming in from a historically underrepresented group here, like a minority entering a predominantly white campus. I will often be in the state of mind of belonging uncertainty, in which I'm wondering about my social self. How am I seen in the eyes of others? And do other people accord me a full measure of respect and regard? And it's that social self that belonging is all about. I think in a lot of cases, we might be pretty self-confident, but feel like, man, this just is not a place where I'm feeling comfortable, where I feel like people are accepting me, where I feel like people see me.
And if you don't feel seen and don't feel accepted, how likely are you to do your best work?
I think pretty unlikely. I mean, it's the research converges on at least when you don't feel seen or respected, it can be really hard to do your best work for a number of different reasons. One, the one we talked about earlier, wherein you might just be so preoccupied. If you're highly identified and you want to succeed, as I did as an assistant professor, you want to succeed, that kind of preoccupation can be psychologically draining. And all that energy could have gone to your work, to advancing some cause that you care about, but instead it's sort of you're churning, you're ruminating, and rumination has this kind of effect where it kind of feeds off of itself. Another way in which it can go awry, or another way in which belonging uncertainty can undermine our ability to do our best work, is by causing us to sort of choke under pressure. And I think the research on stereotype threat by Claude Steele, Josh Aronson, Steve Spencer, and others really kind of makes this point very well, that when we are working in a situation where we feel we could be seen through the lens of a stereotype, rather than recognized for who we are, it is sufficiently preoccupying to undermine our performance. And in this classic work that Steele did with his colleagues, he would, for example, put African American students into a situation where they experience stereotype threat, taking a really difficult standardized intellectual test. And the stereotypes about African Americans, the stereotypes are all about the alleged limitation in their intellectual ability. And so when they're taking that intellectual test, they may understandably wonder about the possibility that if I do poorly, it will confirm the stereotype about me and my group in the eyes of others. And in certain situations, that can be a sufficient preoccupation to undermine even standardized test performance. The kind of key conditions are ones in which it's very hard and you need all your intellectual wits about you to do your best work. And you care because we choke in those situations where we care about doing well. So I would kind of list those as sort of two key ways in which feeling we don't belong can undermine our ability to do our best work. It saps our mental energy, distracts us, and it leads us to choke in these high pressure situations where doing your best is really important. It can be a fork in the road.
So I had my first sort of adult experience with belongingness when I left the working world at 42 years old without a plan. And it wasn't like I was in a terrible situation, but I just wasn't working. I wasn't out engaging with the world every day. And all of a sudden I had sort of this identity crisis about, well, if I don't know how to answer the question, what do you do? Who am I? What role does work play in helping adults feel centered and secure?
I mean, so much. I was reading a bit about your reflections on your own career. I found it really fascinating, and really it kind of resonated a lot with me. This idea that I mean, I don't know if you feel this way, or I'd be curious. You get a lot of belonging from giving yourself to purposes higher than yourself. Calling, kind of following your calling. That's like an interesting word. It's almost like calling, not a career, not a lifestyle, but a calling, as if something is kind of pulling you outside of your own ego. And that is such an important way in which we achieve a sense of belonging, by connecting ourselves to purposes larger than ourselves. And purposes are often social purposes. We are kind of helping other people, supporting other people, entertaining other people, inspiring other people. We are at our best. The research really suggests at our healthiest when we are giving ourselves, when the ego gives its energy to things outside of itself, to issues outside of itself. And so I do think work is really key, or can be very key, work broadly defined, to creating that sense of belonging, because it helps us to feel that kind of sense of an infinite game, right? The kind of Carson idea, infinite game. I'm part of some bigger mission here. I'm part of some bigger mission that will last forever. And that is a great way to feel belonging and feel connected to. I mean, as a professor, I feel that all the time. I'm just part of a long chain, a conversation that will go on forever.
Yeah, well, I think if nothing else, being of service to somebody else takes your mind off of yourself for a few moments. You don't have time to ruminate, like you said earlier, and like I talked to your professional colleague Ethan Cross about a few months ago. right? Like we don't have these conversations in our head going
Oh
like,
yeah.
why isn't the world noticing me? Why am I not more successful? Why does Joe have a better car than I do? Because I'm out there and I'm active and I'm working. And it's like the same reason I want to keep my son in swim lessons, because if he's tired, he's not sitting there, sitting on the couch whining about something that isn't a terrible injustice in his life, right? And we all do that. And I'm as guilty as anybody. He's inherited
Yeah.
my crazy brain. So I recognize it when he's doing it.
Yeah. I mean, the ego is a hard beast to please. It is never satisfied. It is never satisfied. I mean, for me, I mean, maybe if you're a Buddhist monk, I don't know, then the ego is kind of dissolved, I guess. Instead, we're much happier. Our kind of well-being is much better, even at a biological level when we're committed to higher purposes. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I find this really interesting that it's really kind of hard to reassure myself on my own. I mean, I can do it, but if I'm having like a really bad day, right? Things go awry,
Right.
as they do for all of us. It's really hard to self-talk my way out of that. And I think Ethan's work is kind of brilliant in this way. The inner chatter sometimes exacerbates our situation, but it's so easy for someone else to reassure me, to help me to narrate the adversity in a positive, saying, this is a treasure. You learn from this mistake, learn from this failure. I believe in you. So we're really good at helping other people psychologically, I think. I don't know what you think of this, but this is kind of interesting, but kind of bad at helping ourselves. So
I totally agree. Totally agree. And we would say, if you said things that you say to yourself in the mirror to a stranger, you get punched in the face, right? And deservedly so, it's like, you fat piece of crap. I can't believe you're so weak-willed. But you would only take that advice, you're talking about your friend who can give you that objective point of view, but you would only take it from somebody that you feel safe with, right? And so that comes back to belongingness. And what are the places where you feel safe? And how do we create those environments, whether it's home, church, work, political affiliations, which since it's election day, I want to get to that, but we're going to wait for a minute before we go down that rabbit hole, right? So what are the conditions we need to feel safe where we would actually listen to somebody like that?
I don't think it's that difficult. I actually don't think it's that difficult. I have really been amazed. One of the readers of my book put it really better than I did. They were like, one of the implications here is that connection can be found in the most unlikely of places. It can be created in the most unlikely of places. And so what I think a lot of the research that my lab has done, my colleagues have done, throws light on that very point, that little things, we can all do little things to create connection, even in the smallest corners of social life. And it's actually not that hard. Our ability to do so is almost, I put this in the book, as like a superpower. It's like a superpower because we can create belonging, this sort of magical psychological state, through the words we choose, through our actions. And I just think that is our ability to do this is one of the kind of big messages of a lot of the research that's out there. Just to take one example, I love this work by Nick Epley's lab at University of Chicago. Brilliant work where he shows just innumerable ways in which small encounters can create moments of connection and happiness. For instance, this is with Juliana Schroeder, just randomly assigning people to talk with someone, have a little chit chat on the subway for 10 minutes. People believe that's going to make them unhappy, but it actually makes them happier because we like that. We like to connect. And they've shown this over and over, that we often don't create the connections that would make us happy, even in these very kind of everyday situations where we could. Likewise, they find, for instance, that complimenting people, we don't compliment people as much as we do. And they show in a lot of research that when people compliment a close friend, for instance, or a romantic partner, it makes the other person happier than people predict. We get it wrong. We don't understand the power that we have to help other people to feel happy, and in so doing, bolstering the connection we feel. And one more example, random acts of kindness that Epley and his colleagues show in a few other studies that just doing a random act of kindness, like giving away a gift, or they do these lab studies where, I'm going to give my cupcake to another participant. It actually makes the other person much more happy than people predict. And one of the reasons is in this culture, we have like this norm of self-interest, a kind of individualism that makes us feel like, oh, it's just going to be awkward and uncool to kind of go out on a limb and do these things. People are going to think I'm weird. But those things, Epley says, don't matter nearly as much as we think. And what matters much more is the connections that these little gestures can create.
Yeah, in sales, we'd always bring cupcakes or, some nice little, even not terribly expensive, but some nice little gesture that people can't help accepting, and they can't help feeling a little bit more inclined to listen to you for 27 minutes, if you show up with a gift, right?
Totally. I did some research as an undergraduate with a professor named Alice Eisen, who had this amazing experimental intervention, which was simply a little baggie of candy with like Brock's colored candies in it and a ribbon tied around. And the intervention was, the experimenter just says, Paul, I would really like you to have this little bag of candy just as a gesture of my appreciation. Thank you for coming in today.
But you messed it up. But you messed it up, didn't you?
And she finds.
Tell the anecdote.
I did. Okay. The anecdote is, after I was working in this lab, I'm such a, in some ways I am really clueless, really clueless. So I kind of really, so in some ways, you can really get these things wrong. So I wanted to get to know someone as a student. I was a student, she was a student, and I knocked on her door and I said, "Oh, here's a little bag of candy. I'd just like to give to you because, I appreciate you. I appreciate you." And her face lit up with a bright smile, and she was clearly moved. And then I blew it, and I said, this gift has been shown in randomized control studies to be an effective mood induction, an induction of positive affect. And you could see the kind of positive mood drain from her face as I said that. And then she closed the door, and that was that.
Because she thought you were a manipulative creep, right?
Yep. Which highlights a really important lesson. That all of these activities, these so-called these practices that we do, they have to be authentic. They're kind of like protocols for politeness. And I think we're all kind of learning here to kind of how to kind of express ourselves in ways that create connection and that are authentic. And so I think one of the kind of key issues that is very important is that we feel that connection when we feel like we're being treated authentically, and for who this person is, authentic, spontaneity. This is the person's true self coming through. And that is really important for these small gestures. So I think sometimes when social psychologists talk about this research, they don't emphasize that point. It's like, oh, here's like a little intervention, right? I'm going to give you a bag of candy, or I'm going to, have you do this activity like talking about your most important values, another sort of psychological activity that's been shown to be beneficial. They don't understand, that what's really key isn't the kind of material intervention, but the psychological meaning it creates, which is someone cares, we are connecting, someone is interested in me, someone sees me. And that's really important. It is about the psychological meaning of these gestures, not the literal behavioral act that matters.
All right, let's talk about aspirational belonging. Groucho Marx famously said something to the effect of, "I wouldn't want to belong to a club that would have me as a member." What does that tell you about human nature?
I wouldn't want to belong to a club that would have me as a member. We are always aspiring. I'd be curious what you think, but we are always aspiring for more status beyond what we already have. We're like little elitists. And so we want to kind of belong to the tribe or group that will enhance our self-worth. And I think what you're saying is almost the psychology of someone with low self-esteem too. If someone accepts me, they must not be worthy, or they must not be a true source of validation. That's not validating, because as a person with low self-esteem, when I'm accepted, it kind of casts doubt on the other person's judgment. So it's a little bit of the psychology of low self-esteem as well, I think. What do you think?
Well, I think it's a perfect joke, because it really does capture our desire to increase our status through association. But it's leading me to the question of, like, is it okay to not belong in every group? Like, would you rather be in a cult or be alone? What's healthier for us?
Yeah. Well, one of the key things about the need to belong is, like, it's a fundamental need we have as human beings, but it can kind of channel us into some horrific directions or into some heroic ones. So, people will throw themselves into a barrage of bullets if they think it will protect the people they love. At the same time, research suggests that when people feel as though they have no port on the shore, that they are lacking a sense of belonging or connection in their lives, they become vulnerable to the appeals of hate groups and extremist groups. Ari Kruglansky wrote a few awesome books on this topic, showing that and arguing that a lot of people who join extremist and hate groups don't do so because they initially subscribe to the ideology. Rather, they do so because the group is a place where the organization is a place where they feel important. They feel like someone who matters. And I tell the story of CPL, so just a wonderful story of a person who really turned around. He joined the KKK. This is back in the 70s, and became a grand wizard for the KKK. And he was someone who had very few connections in his life. His family life was a mess. Economically, he was feeling left behind. But then these people from the KKK would stop by his work and just ask him questions, hang out with him, and he felt good. Then they invited him to an initiation ceremony. And as he describes it, when he looks back, he was like kneeling before the cross, and everyone was applauding him. And he felt like someone, this little old person, someone who mattered. And so that need to belong can really be exploited by these extremist groups. Fortunately for him, he kind of had this amazing transformation experience by befriending a Black activist, Ann Atwater, at the time. And they worked together in common purpose to improve the schooling in Durham, North Carolina. And they worked together. And through that friendship, he actually turned around and in front of this huge ceremony, ripped up his KKK card. And it's just an amazing story how showing so many things that first, people can be turned back from these horrific paths. And second, a lot of times when people, not always, but a lot of times when people join these extremist organizations or do something terrible or behave objectionably, it's not necessarily because they lack character or lack values. It's often a sign of their desire to connect with something beyond themselves. And that need can really be distorted to evil ends. And these organizations are really good at exploiting it, which is a big problem.
Right. Well, along those lines, Robert Putnam years ago wrote a book called Bowling Alone, which sort of lamented the decline in social institutions in the United States. What can be done here? Where can we find associations in the world if we don't have churches and bowling leagues and book clubs as we used to? Do we all just go online and find, subreddits to dig down deep to try to find other lonely people out there? All fairness to the legitimate people on Reddit, but that's where people seem to be going now, right?
Yeah, I mean, the research on social media isn't so favorable, at least for the moment, especially for young people. It seems to undercut belonging, undercut well-being, partly because it's kind of inauthentic and performative, partly because it can kind of get so toxic, partly because there's so much opportunity for upward social comparisons where you feel just, everyone's presenting their best self. So you feel like you're the only one who's experiencing difficulty or adversity. And all those things combined can really make those kinds of online connections not so vital, not so energizing, not so real. Instead, what seems to be better is that the old Howard Beale's philosophy: turn it off. And the research suggests that when people get off of Facebook, for instance, it's roughly equivalent to a third of the effect of going to therapy. So removing yourself from this environment turns out to be beneficial to well-being. And in some other research, it's been shown to kind of give people more time to invest in civic associations and clubs and extracurricular activities, for instance, for young people, that actually bring about that true source, that kind of authentic sense of belonging that is so psychologically and even physiologically beneficial to us. So joining, I think these little organizations are all around us. Volunteer organizations have been shown to be really effective for creating connection and improving well-being and health. That's one. That's pretty simple. Committing yourself, as we were talking about, to organizations that are involved in making the world a better place. These are opportunities that are around many of us. Even simply spending more time with friends and family. Liz Dunn and her lab have shown that just putting your phone away when you're having a meal with friends or family makes people much more present in the interaction and enjoy it much more. So I think there's like little things. There are so many forces that divide us: the rise of social media, the institutional biases and systems of exclusion that are out there in the world. And I fully believe we need to kind of push the ball forward in creating systemic change. But at the same time, I think that that every day in very small places we can find ways to connect and find ways to give ourselves over to other people and other purposes. There are opportunities all around.
Early in the book, you make a very interesting observation that seems somewhat counterintuitive. And you talk about a survey of law school students and the degree to which certain groups feel that as if they belong. And the two groups in this one particular law school that said they felt the least connection, and I'm paraphrasing here, so please correct my language, but the ones that felt the least belongingness there were Black women and conservative white men, I believe. That seems to be contradictory.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Well, let me ask you, in what way does it seem contradictory?
Got demographically contrasting groups, right? So it's not as if one type of person necessarily feels, as if it's not as if there is a monopoly on belongingness by demographics in this situation in that school. Yeah.
In this situation. Yeah. I use that example just to make the point that all of us, we're kind of in this moment in American culture that Pete Buttigieg calls a crisis of belonging, where very few people, very few groups feel confident in their belonging. And you have these sort of politically, seemingly diametrically opposed groups, both feeling equally alienated on campus for obviously different reasons. The discrimination, prejudice, institutional bias against Black people is a powerful force affecting their real opportunities to belong. So the kind of historical legacies of racism and sexism, in this case for Black women, are very, very, very influential in shaping their sense of belonging and their real opportunities to belong and connect. Meanwhile, for white conservative men, they feel on the predominantly liberal campus that they don't belong. And in our interviews with some of them, they say, I can't really express my opinions. I can't really say what I think. I can't really be my true self without condemnation. And so they feel themselves like as though they don't belong either for completely different reasons. And I just use that as an example as how we're kind of in this kind of point in history where very few of us feel tied or connected to, feel that anchorage that helps us to feel like we belong. And very few groups feel confident in their sense of belonging. We seem to be in this era of a crisis of belonging.
So what do you do there? Because, I've heard so many anecdotes, and in today's world, you don't know what to believe and what not to believe, but you hear so many anecdotes about, okay, well, diversity training was brought in to help people try to feel more as if they belong. And yet what happens is it ends up alienating half of the room, right? So how do you create diversity training that doesn't suck?
Well, so diversity training in some ways, diversity training can be effective because it sets new norms. It says, our organization is committed to making diversity work, but that's often not enough. And the kinds of diversity practices that seem to work best create sort of coalitions of people working together to improve the climate in day-to-day encounters. And that includes just simply, for instance, gender-inclusive policies. Toni Schmader, a social psychologist, and her colleagues have shown that simply the availability of, kind of consistent availability of gender-inclusive social policies, like the ability to report harassment, the opportunities that are provided for family workplace balance, such as opportunities for childcare or support for childcare, opportunities for parental leave, that these policies are highly predictive of women's feelings of inclusion and feeling that they're not stereotyped at work. So I feel as though one problem with diversity training, though it can set a powerful norm, is that it's kind of like a shot in the arm. It's like one thing, and then we expect magic. But really,
Right.
the best sorts of practices are ones that sort of weave connection and inclusion into the day-to-day lives of their workers through gender-inclusive policies, through there's this wonderful work by Jessie Smith in which she shows that just creating these little pods of faculty, this is in higher education, that work together to advance gender equity. They go from department to department in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math departments, and just talk to people and work with them to create sort of concrete plans for improving gender diversity and raising people's awareness of the issue so that they can draw their own conclusions rather than feeling strong-armed. This program has shown remarkable effects. It's actually at the school she implemented it. It led to complete gender parity in faculty hires in the STEM disciplines. So there's a lot of points of light in diversity at work.
Do you think if we called it belongingness instead of diversity, people would be more open to having the conversation?
I hope so.
Belongingness doesn't threaten me, I think everybody should feel like they belong, but diversity seems to exclude certain populations,
Yeah. It turns out that when you talk about multiculturalism, unfortunately, many whites and men feel excluded, and then they don't support it as much in some studies that's been shown. So,
but would I want to work for a place where everybody felt like they could belong and contribute? Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah, from all walks of life. Now, what does that mean?
Right. Okay, well, that's harder.
How do we create that? Yeah, that's harder.
I thought I was just filling out a survey, Geoff.
And that ultimately boils down to this, what I call situation crafting. It's not about so much changing people's hearts and minds or attitudes. It's about kind of creating day-to-day situations that provide opportunities for inclusion and connection.
And is that about seeing the other person's humanity?
Yeah. There's
giving us an opportunity to recognize the heart and soul behind that face.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really taken by this. I'm a little bit of an etymologist. I love studying the origins of words, before they were corrupted by the dark side. What did the word originally mean? And I have a few. There's a few examples that stuck with me, but one is respect. Respect. The word respect, which has coinage both with young people and more. My son uses it, and I use it as a middle-aged guy. What does that actually mean? And the etymology is to look again, respectate. I just love that. That means that we want to look closer to really understand the person and see their true self. And there are many strategies for doing this, but I think it boils down to that, looking closer, making the person feel seen. I tell one story of a colleague of mine who I interviewed about his experience in high school. He's a black man who got a scholarship to a private high school, and long story short, he was kind of coasting. He was doing okay, but he really wasn't realizing his potential. Then one day, his social studies teacher called him over after class and said to him, "You know, Mohammed, because you're black, people are gonna expect less of you, but not me, not me. I'm gonna expect you to achieve the high standards that I set for you because I believe you can do it." And Mohammed said that really just inspired him. And he did change course after that. And then when I asked him why, I was just like, why? And he said, because I felt seen. I felt like my whole self was seen by this person. And that's the amazing thing, I think, about a lot of social connections is that, there might be like powerful forces at work, right? Racism, discrimination of social media and media that monetizes fear and outrage. But yet, in these small corners of social life, we can actually fight back just a little bit, and sometimes a lot.
All right. And so there's no greater place, I think, where all of us as a society need to try to see each other better than in the realm of politics. So I'm not looking to get into a political discussion so much as I am trying to understand the nature of why we come to our beliefs. So do we choose our political beliefs, or do our political beliefs choose us?
Our political beliefs choose us. I mean, one of the big predictors of political beliefs is just the area you grew up or what your parents' political orientation is. So they are almost like little viruses that you catch, kind of sort of cognitive viruses that sort of infect us, for better or worse. The virus is perhaps an unfair term, but we inherit the beliefs, the opinions, the values of the groups to which we belong, for better and for worse. And in that sense, our beliefs choose us. They choose us. And we may, over time, escape that influence, elaborate on that influence so we really appreciate the kind of understandings underlying the positions of our group. But our attitudes, by and large, are not bottom up, but top down.
Okay, so now, does our need for belongingness discourage us to find more nuanced or moderate political positions?
I think so. I think so. I would say in American politics, that is true. We want to signal to our groups that we are good Democrats or Republicans, which leads to a kind of one-upmanship that leads to more extreme beliefs. And that desire to feel like we are good people, like this is a sort of fundamental human being, human motive. We want to be individuals of integrity, and being individuals of integrity mean that we are adhering to the norms and values of our group. And so that can lead us both to good things and to bad things. And in the realm of politics, it can lead to, it can fuel extremism. One study that I did years ago demonstrated something like this, in which we presented Democrats and Republicans with the two welfare policies. One was really generous in its benefits. One was really, let's say, draconian in its benefits.
We call that austere on the right.
Austere. Got it. Thank you. Thank you. These words are important too. It's George Orwell. Yeah. Okay, good. Austere. Perfect. Austere or generous. And as you would expect, liberals like the generous policy, and conservatives prefer the austere policy. But then, for a separate group of participants, we said, Republican lawmakers support the generous policy, and Democrat lawmakers support the austere policy. And it allowed us to answer the question, what matters more, party or policy? And the answer is party.
And so the people actually, the conservatives tended to agree with the ones that were party endorsed, even though they go against the nature of the party's orientation.
Absolutely. So it's not ideology or the facts of the policy that really matter here. It is the position of your party. It is party over policy. Now, it's not always party totally over policy. Subsequent replications of the research do, though, show that party is a really powerful part. The position of your party is a very powerful driver of your own political beliefs in areas as diverse as COVID policy, environmental policy. I think they even did it in European country with attitudes towards countries' national symbols and flags. So it's been shown time and again that we rely on the position of our party, which makes some sense. Of course, it makes sense to kind of the people you trust, right? You kind of, Democrat lawmakers like this, so maybe there's something going on here that I don't know, and so I'm going to use their judgments. The problem is that, well, if Democrats and Republicans can't even agree on the very policy that their own side would present if it had the choice, what could they ever agree on?
Well, right, and for the record, I'm not. I'm one of those wishy-washy fiscal conservative social liberals that drive everybody mad. So, and I have no group to adhere to. I have no signs in my yard today. I'm the only person in the neighborhood. When those,
Yeah. So were you always like that? How did you get to be that way? Because it's an interesting question, right?
I think I grew up in the 80s. I think I was like, I identified with Alex P. Keaton from Family Ties. Remember?
Yeah, Michael J. Fox.
That's right. Yeah. And I was even though I'm from Georgia, I was a big Reagan kid because I liked the American positivity and optimism and all that. I didn't understand a lot of policies at the time. And I think in retrospect, I'd have issue with a lot of those. At the same time, you can see why, as great a man as Jimmy Carter is and was, why his sort of soft, long-term, well thought out plans didn't win people over. I mean, like, so I guess I adopted my father's politics. And then as an adult, I've moved around. I've lived in New York, San Francisco, and LA for the past 18 years. And when I moved back to Atlanta 11 years ago, I was really reminded of a kind of conservatism that I'd forgotten about for 2 decades, or maybe was never even aware of. And so I'm definitely to the left of center, at least in our neighborhood and among our group set of friends. But, I'm certainly not, I wouldn't call myself, I'm an independent. I am neither Democrat nor Republican.
Yeah. Do you think kind of moving from place to place was helpful in that? So moving back to Atlanta, moving to California, like kind of just having different points of view that you were kind of experiencing?
It's not even points of view. It's sort of assumptions, man. I mean, like, it's like, in LA, you are assumed to have certain political positions, based on what kind of work you do and what neighborhood you live in. Now, in Orange County, it might be different than in Santa Monica, but like, people assume that you're a Democrat in San Francisco and LA. In Atlanta, if you're white and male and middle-aged, they assume you're Republican until proven otherwise, or unless you got, some other external signs showing that you might not lean the same way that they do.
And you kind of reacted against the assumptions. You saw the assumptions and you felt like, yeah, I am not cool with this.
I wasn't even aware of the assumptions until I moved back here, and I grew up here, and I mean, and I really love it here. It's just, the norm, I had not considered the political norms of what I was bringing with me back to Atlanta. And I've definitely, it's definitely moved me a little right. Although I still am, I'm firmly not committed to either camp, which is very frustrating. It's a very frustrating place to be right now.
Yeah. It's I think so. I think it's almost like you don't have your own political tribe.
Well, and the slices of what it means to be in a political tribe right now are getting, more and more extreme. And so it's hard. Yeah. It's really,
I'm very interested in when people change. So that's why I'm asking, like, how does that happen? That people become more complex or more multifaceted in their views? And one answer seems to be that they experience different groups of people, different alliances that kind of give them a more nuanced understanding of things. In a really classic study were, done over decades. They found they were looking at these conservative students. Conservative students, all women in this case, going to they were all from very conservative families. This is back in, I think, the 1930s. All from very conservative families, and these women then went to a very liberal college.
Sure.
Named Bennington College. At the time, it was a kind of sort of liberal hotbed. And one of the things they found is that, you would think, right? You would think, oh no, it's all economics, it's all demographics that determine your political views. No, actually, those women changed over the course of their 4 years at Bennington. They became more liberal. And I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. It's just interesting that experience help them, kind of getting a new group, help them to break free of the old group. And we see in a lot of these studies that the group is both the biggest barrier to change, like an allegiance to a previous group, but also the biggest catalyst to change. If you can kind of go outside your comfort zone and experience different people and different points of view. So that's one thing. Like when people change, it's not just about sort of imbibing facts. It's about connecting with people who are different and coming from different points of view, and really hearing and seeing them. The second thing I think, that we probably really both agree on here is just the dearth of good conversations is getting increasingly hard because of our extremism, just to have good conversations about complex social issues. Liberals and conservatives, you just can't. It's very hard, very hard.
And it's all these conversations they're entirely binary, but by nature the issues are not. They're highly nuanced, and the answer isn't 0 or 1. It's somewhere. It's and I don't want to throw Thomas Sowell at you, but I'll do it. There's no solutions. There's only compromises, right? And so in all these issues, it's somewhere in the middle. We got to deal with grays, and nobody wants to deal with gray because no party, drives its affiliation based on nuance. They drive it based on platitudes and certainties, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the best policies often come out of considerations of both conservative and liberal points of view. You need kind of balance, not for all, but for some. Not for all issues, but for some. That balance of perspective. I mean, it's led to a lot of the social psychological practices and interventions that we study. The conservative critique, for example, of intervention, that it creates dependency and rewards non-coping and stigmatizes beneficiaries. Like those conservative critiques are incorporated into a lot of the research on so-called wise interventions to bring about positive social change. So the conservative critique in this research is taken very seriously, but that doesn't discourage the researchers from intervening. It just encourages them to intervene in a wiser, smarter way. But sort of circling back, in spite, I think, of all the division, there is there are some hopeful examples of conversations and practices and organizations that actually do foster good, constructive conversations across the political fault line.
Now, this is the only time I've been a middle-aged man, right? Which is in my life, right? So, this is the first time I've been responsible for a younger generation. It's the first time I've had 55 decades worth of experience to think back on. And so I don't want to, indulge myself in thinking that things were better back in 1945, right after the war. But it does seem that back then people identified as Americans before they identified as a party member. Knowing what you know about belongingness and the way that you can inspire those things, what do you think we can do to help people identify as Americans before they identify by their party affiliation?
It's such a great question. I think creating opportunities for people to connect across party lines is just absolutely essential. I remember reading an editorial by a senator, this is many years back, maybe 15, 20 years, and it really stuck with me. He was writing about how Republicans and Democrats in the Senate don't go out to lunch anymore. Because they're always, the kind of schedule is so tight and the fundraising takes up so much of their time that and the extremism and division to contribute, that they just don't do these social things together that they used to. And he thought that that's important. When you create those relationships, then you create a sense of sort of common identity. You're liberal, I'm conservative, and yet we can break bread together. And we have an allegiance to values that transcend both of our party alliances. And I think those sorts of moments where we're connecting, like they seem unimportant. They seem unimportant, yet they are maybe much more powerful than we think. And there is, one of the things that goes hand in hand with the division and political polarization and vilification that we see is segregation. Right now, Democrats and Republicans are more geographically segregated than I think they've been, probably since the 1800s. As far as I know, on average, if I can recall, 20 million voters for their day-to-day lives, only 1 in 10 of their encounters are with someone from the other political side. So we're just kind of segregated. And so we don't have those opportunities to break bread together. So I think that's one answer. For me, here's one really inspiring example. This is work by David Brookman and Josh Khalid that shows that, you can still, in spite of the division, create connections and generate intergroup understanding, generate understanding between liberals and conservatives in a conversation. And what they do is they go door to door. These are canvassers talking to conservative voters. So this is in one of the most conservative districts in Florida, Miami-Dade, as I recall. And the canvassers have a 10-minute conversation with the voters about transgender rights. And what they find is that months later, as a result of these conversations, the conservative voters become more supportive of transgender rights and more willing to take a stand against hate propaganda against transgender people. What do they do in those 10-minute conversations? Somehow they kind of create this, like this old senator's story, these kind of opportunities to converse in an environment away from our party allegiances. So it's just two people talking. The canvassers don't bombard the voter with information and facts. It's not like an argument. They kind of don't do that. Instead, they just raise the issue and they talk about it. And they do a few other things, but that's kind of key. There's no reactance. I'm just kind of sharing information. We're having a legitimate conversation meaning just sort of to turn the issue over together. And that kind of permits people to draw their own conclusions about the issue. And they find that these 10-minute conversations, which have a few other issues, a few other ingredients, one key one being the exchange of stories. Like, let me tell you a story about a transgender person who was really hurt by being excluded. Why don't you tell me a story about a time in your life when you felt excluded because of something about you that you couldn't change? And through this kind of sharing of stories, that the canvasser and the voter connect and change is catalyzed.
They're trying to convert him, Geoff. That's what they're doing. Okay, that was a joke. Sorry. Hey, well, thanks for this great conversation, by the way. This has been very satisfying and interesting to me and hopefully to our listeners. The name of the book is Belonging, The Science of Creating Connections and Bridging Divides by my guest, Geoff Cohen. Geoff, where can our listeners find out more about you and your work?
They can go to my website, geoffreylcohen.com. Spelling my name, GeoffreyLCohen.com.
Geoff, thanks for your time and for your work. Best of luck.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Hey, everybody. If you like what we're up to here at Crazy Money, do us and yourself a favor by following the show on your favorite podcast app and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Also, click the link in the show notes to subscribe to my new Substack, where you'll get bi-weekly thoughts on the role of money in our world and in our lives directly to your email inbox. Thanks for sticking around. We will see you next week.